I had not planned on going to Miles' house to murder him. But to be fair, I had not gone there not planning on murdering him either. I am not sure what I had thought I was doing when I crossed over our connected front yards and pressed his doorbell. It was pretty late at the time, it had to be past 10, but still true to form he invited me in with a sincere smile on his face. Usually, in a situation like this, you'd expect a long silence or for the person who owned the house expecting you to get to the point. But not Miles Burgess. The minute I passed the threshold it was blah blah this and blah blah that. Every other sentence punctuated with a hearty laugh and a good-natured slap on the back. The thought of hurrying me along had not even crossed his mind. Instead, he motioned me to the kitchen and offered me a piece of steak he had grilled earlier but had been unable to eat. Without waiting for a reply, he took the slab of meat from its spot on the counter and placed it in the oven. I sat down at his table while he grabbed plates, silverware, napkins, and a cold beer out of the fridge. The whole time he talked about how interesting it was we were both night owls and started making plans for future midnight talks on his back porch. Finally, he pulled the T-bone steak back out of the oven, carefully placed the now warm meal in front of me, and grabbed the seat beside me. "You really did me a favor, buddy," he informed me with the same levels of honesty and warmth his words always carried. "Now I don't have to go through the trouble of putting it in a Ziploc and finding a place for it in the fridge." I stared at him blankly. The amount of work he just did to get the steak ready for me was far more than it would have taken to put the thing in the fridge. But listening to him I could tell he honestly found putting all of it together for someone easier than saving it to feed himself later. As usual, I was aware of how decent of a person the guy sitting a few feet away from me was. At his core, Miles was a good man. "So, what can I do for you this evening?" For a silent moment, Miles sat beside me with his trademark room-brightening smile. But as that moment fell away and the silence was broken as I tightened my grip around the handle of the steak knife he had laid out for me. With a quick, fluid motion I jabbed the serrated blade in the direction of Miles' throat. I applied a significant amount of force and braced my arm for an amount of resistance to the impact that was unrealistic. When I was done, the blade was deep enough inside his flesh the base of the grip was touching his skin. "I came to do that," I answered his question with a bit of uncertainty in my voice. "I guess." It was silent again while I continued to clutch the handle of the knife. I was now standing out of my seat, looking down at Miles, and could tell I had missed his windpipe, which I had been trying to hit. Instead, I had plunged the knife into the area just to the right of his throat. Miles just looked at me. His warm smile was gone. Instead, his eyes looked at me with confusion. In that 5 or so seconds with the knife still in his neck, he didn't fight me. He didn't even stand up or try to get a hold of the plastic grip of the knife. His mind still had not fully processed what had happened to him. But slowly the understanding pushed through the denial, and he began to open his mouth. I'm not sure if he was about to scream or say something. Knowing Miles, he was probably going to ask if he had accidentally done something to upset me. I was not interested in talking to him anymore though, so I quickly pulled the steak knife out of his throat. Instead of the sounds he had meant to make, the noise that escaped him was a wet coughing sound from both his mouth and the hole in his neck. Blood poured out of both of them as well. Now aware of his state, Miles fell backward in his chair, clutching at his throat with both of his hands. He was probably hoping to stop the loss of blood, but there was too much of it to do so with his own strength. A guttural choking noise started to work its way out of him while he rolled around on the ground. I walked over to Miles as the color in his face drained away and the pool of blood around him grew wider. It had all happened so fast. I was aware that I must have hit the jugular while I watched Miles writhing around begin to slow. His eyes glazed and Miles stopped moving altogether. "Huh," I mumbled to myself while I looked over the now lifeless corpse of my next-door neighbor. Not at all like I had expected. I shrugged. Looking down at the knife in my hand still dripping with Miles' blood, I felt waves of consciousness washing over me. From the second I had walked into his house it had all felt like a dream. Looking down at Miles, it was obvious everything that had just happened was a reality. "Oh well," I said quietly to myself with a second shrug. I got down on my knees in the warm pool of blood around Miles. With both hands, I held the knife over his chest. I took a breath and plunged it with enough force to break through his rib cage. A crushing and gushing noise filled the kitchen. The resistance in his chest forced me to use a bit of strength to pull it back out. I held it over Miles' body. Again and again, I stabbed it into him. Over and over I stabbed him until sweat started to drip down my forehead and into my eyes. I used my wrist in an attempt to rub the stinging liquid away, but I only succeeded in smearing blood across my face. Understanding it was futile, I decided to work through the discomfort, continuing to stab the hunk of meat more and more. I'm not sure how many times I stabbed him in the end. There wasn't a purpose for doing it, and I hadn't thought to keep count. It just seemed like the thing to do at the time. I only stopped my work when I felt too tired to continue. But for good measure, I mustered the strength to stick the knife deep inside what was left of Miles one more time. I did not pull it back out. With some difficulty, I pushed myself off the ground, feeling the aching in my knees from kneeling for too long. I used some of the napkins from the table he had gotten for me earlier to wipe enough of my sweat and his blood from my face and hands to feel comfortable. I tossed them on the floor around me. Before heading back out the front door of his house, I grabbed the steak off the table where I had been sitting. On the way across the two lawns towards my house, I thought of taking a bite of the steak. In the end, I decided to wait until I was inside where I could grab some utensils. Ever since I was little, eating steak fat grossed me out. When I woke up the next morning, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. The mistake had not been killing Miles. As far as I am concerned, my actions were neither a mistake or a success. Instead, my mistake had been the complete lack of effort to cover up my actions. I had been so carefree and tired following the act, I had left a trail of evidence from his kitchen right to my front door. Climbing out of bed, I felt the previous night's repercussion on my own body. I am not much for exercise, so my chest and shoulders were sore after the workout of repeatedly bringing the knife down on Miles' chest an uncounted amount of times. My legs had also become tight from the extended period of kneeling over the body, and the tenderness in my knees told me they were bruised from carrying my weight on the linoleum floor. The worst pain was in my hands. The skin of both palms was covered in the torn skin where the blisters had formed and broken away. My wrists felt fine when they were motionless, but when I tried to use them in any way, the sudden pain would cause me to involuntarily exhale. I assumed this was from a continuous combination of the impact of the knife hitting bone and floor, and the strain from prying the knife back out. Slowly I made my way to my feet and headed towards the dresser on the far side of my bedroom. Along the way, I pulled off the still bloody clothes I had been wearing the night before. I gently tossed them on the bed, figuring I'd need to burn them and the sheets at some point later in the day. Down to my underwear, I put on a pair of grey sweatpants and a white sweatshirt. My reflection in the mirror showed both bright colors, only seemed to draw attention to the dried blood on my hands and face. At that moment I wished I had showered the night before, but I knew I didn't have time to do it now. Pulling the hood up on the sweatshirt, I headed out of the bedroom and down the stairs. Walking out the front door, it was immediately evident I was probably already too late to achieve anything. A police car was parked in Miles' driveway and a few more sat on the curb in front of his house. His front door was open and a single piece of bright yellow tape with back lettering spelling "Crime Scene Do Not Cross" was pulled across. The flimsy barrier did not last long. About the time it caught my attention, a hulking figure in a navy blue uniform pushed past, sending it to the ground. The figure turned on the front stoop of the house and grasped metal railing. He threw his head over the top of the barrier. A retch followed by a wet splatter echoed over the yards as he evacuated his breakfast into the flower garden that lined the base of Miles' house. He pulled his head back up over the banister, and I could tell by the wrinkles on his pale face and his mostly grey hair he was an older officer. Standing in my driveway, I thought about how it was too late to do anything about the inside of Miles' house. Anything I left in there would already be in their possession. Thinking it over, I figured the evidence included fingerprints, my bloody footprints, the murder weapon, and about a dozen other things. I didn't remember drinking any of the beer, so they wouldn't get DNA from my saliva. I sighed and scratched the back of my head, forgetting about the dried blood covering them. I placed both of them in the sweatshirt pocket. I guess this is why people don't usually do this, I thought, a little disappointed in this outcome. Or maybe it's that whole thing about the value of human life. I had never really understood the whole idea of us all being inherently valuable based on being alive. I had read philosophy for required college courses were dead, or almost dead. People argued about why people mattered. All I remembered taking from these classes was how these individual people were desperately trying to make a case for why they were personally inherently important. Maybe I just didn't get it, but philosophy all seemed a bit desperate to me. But the nervous looks on my professor and fellow students' faces when I voiced an opinion about the value of human life told me it was not an accepted viewpoint. I didn't change my opinion, but I learned not to bring it up around other people. Morning. An authoritative voice asked, evacuating all of the thoughts of philosophy and college out of my mind. I turned towards the voice as it moved down my driveway. It was a stocky man wearing the same navy blue uniform as the guy who had just vomited in Miles' flowers a minute ago. This guy was younger though and had less of the markings sewn on the uniform as his counterpart. This younger cop also didn't look as sick. But I did make note of him appearing a little pretty pale. "My name is Officer Baker," the cop informed me as he pulled a notepad and pen out of his chest pocket. "Mind if I ask you a few questions about last night?" "Sure." I knew it was a matter of time before he saw the dried blood if he had not already. I could hide my hands in my pocket, but the blood on my forehead and neck would be impossible to hide even with my hood up. Both turning myself in and trying to run for it seemed like foolish, impulsive moves though. I figured if he had caught me there was not much I could do about it now anyway. "You are William Canova, correct?" "Yes, sir." "How well did you know your neighbor Miles Burgess?" Officer Baker asked, not hiding the fact Miles was dead. "I knew him pretty well," I answered, not hiding the fact I knew he was dead. "He moved in 6 months ago. We didn't hang out or anything, but I knew him better than any of the other neighbors due to his nature." "His nature?" Officer Baker inquired, writing down everything I was saying onto the note paper. "What do you mean by that?" "Miles was a pretty outgoing guy," I answered, watching the methodical movement of Baker's hands. "He was the kind of guy who would ask you how you were doing and turned it into a conversation. He just kind of sucked you in." "Sounds like Mr. Burgess was a good guy." "Yeah? Miles was a good man. Did you see or hear anything last night coming from Mr. Burgess' residence? Officer Baker said, looking up at me from his pad and paper. Nothing at all, I lied, knowing that just because I accepted my imminent rest didn't mean I had to admit anything. Anything at all, Mr. Kinover? Officer Baker said, removing the pen from paper and dropping his hands to his side. He took a step closer to me and began speaking in a more hushed tone. Even if what you heard or saw is something that seems utterly impossible in real life, you can trust I don't think of you as a liar or a madman. I swear. I am a friend. No, I lied after a few solid seconds of confused silence. I didn't see or hear anything over the last night, ordinary or otherwise. All right then, Officer Baker said, with a mixture of disappointment and skepticism in his voice. He took a step back from me and began writing on the notepad again. Well, Mr. Kinover, I will let you know if I hear anything on our end. I'd keep my door locked for the next few days just in case. And if your story changes and you remember seeing anything unusual or strange last night, give us a call and ask for me personally. Have a nice day. I returned the sentiment while I watched the officer make his way down my driveway. The gears in my head feverishly spinning, trying to understand what had just happened. Baker had not even treated me like a possible suspect. There had been no way he could not have recognized the blood on my face. The memory of him assuring me he was a friend in hushed tones playing over and over in my head. I couldn't shake the confusion for the rest of the day while I cleaned up my house from the events of the night before. Around 6 that night I got back home from the pit deep in their woods where I had finished burning the last of the clothes I wore. But I knew that all of that would only delay the inevitable until they analyzed the DNA I'd left everywhere. I knew from a bit of research I had conducted at a stoplight that it could take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, but still I prepared myself for further questioning from the police. A week and a half passed and I had heard nothing. Deep down I knew it was dumb to tempt fate, but it didn't make any sense. It didn't take a modern-day Sherlock Holmes to tell I had clearly killed Miles. But even if I was just exaggerating how obvious it was in my mind, there had surely been enough evidence to warrant a second interview with me. I could feel myself starting to get paranoid, and it was a deviation from my usual state of mind I did not like. So, I decided to call Officer Baker to get to the bottom of this regardless of the consequences. In a small town like this, it only took a few seconds to get in touch with the operator at the police station, and when she transferred me, Officer Baker answered on the second ring. "Hello, Officer Baker speaking," a gruff voice came from the speaker in my phone. "What can I do for you today?" "Yeah," I replied, second-guessing my decision. "This is Will Conover. My neighbor Miles Burgess was murdered last week and you told me." "Don't say anything else," Officer Baker interrupted. His voice now hushed to keep others from hearing him. "You don't know who could be listening in." I was just. "Shut up, damn you," Officer Baker whispered, yelled through the speaker. "If you have any information or just want answers, to come to the Old Town Center at midnight tonight." Before I could say anything else, Officer Baker hung up the phone. For a few minutes I just sort of stared at the screen of my phone. I had no idea what was going on anymore, and I was starting to feel agitated about everything. Again, this was a feeling I am not accustomed to feeling. The rational part of my mind calmly explained this was surely some kind of trap, and going to this meeting place would just end up with me in handcuffs. The growing infuriated corner of my mind screamed that it didn't matter if it was a trap or not. I was going to figure out what was going on in this town. Around 11:45 that night I drove my car up to the town center for whatever was waiting for me inside. It had taken me longer to find it than I had thought. He had said Old Town Center, and I spent a while looking for an abandoned meeting area. But it turned out the building that housed the rented meeting rooms was just called Old Town Center. Pulling into a spot, I stepped out of the car and headed into the building. Walking into the lobby, I figured I would have to make my way around the darkened building to find the meeting center for an ambush. Instead, I found the place bright and still open for meetings. I walked up to the bored-looking teen sitting behind the main desk. "I'm looking for Officer Baker." I started looking down at the receptionist who kept her eyes on the computer screen in front of her. "Meeting room A," she said, still not making eye contact with me. She pointed to a hallway on her right. "Down that way and the last room on the left." I thanked her and began walking in the direction she had pointed. Making my way down the fluorescent light hallway, I noticed a big dry erase sign beside the last door on the left. It was difficult to make out at first, but as I got closer I could read the words hastily written on the board. "Enough is enough. Lead speaker Officer Leroy Baker." Bewildered, I didn't take my eyes off the sign until I turned into the open door of meeting room A. The meeting room was clearly the building's largest meeting room. It was full of stadium seating with 2 sets of stairs making their way down either side of the massive chairs. Almost every chair had a person sitting in it. They were clearly all people from the town because I recognized a lot of them without really knowing who they were. I'd first seen them. I was able to make out the face of the huge old cop I had seen vomiting in Miles Flowers the week before. There were also a few other faces I remembered making their way in and out of the crime scene throughout that morning. Still fairly convinced this was some odd plan to ambush me, I continued into the room anyway. I was eventually able to find a single open seat in almost the direct middle of the chairs. I carefully sidestepped in front of people having hushed conversations until I made it to the spot and took my place. I admitted to myself if this was an unorthodox arrest it had worked. I was right in the middle of at least a quarter of the town's adult population. At midnight exactly, the lights in the auditorium dimmed. It was still more than bright enough to see everyone around me in the room, but the change had succeeded in hushing the crowd. From a spot on the right at the far corner of the meeting room, a familiar stocky figure stepped in front of the crowd. Although he was not wearing the police uniform he had on when we previously talked, I recognized him clearly. "Welcome back everyone," Officer Baker said to the now completely silent crowd of townsfolk. "I would like to thank you all for taking time out of your night to meet me here. As we all know, the threats surrounding us are both real and multifaceted." Mumbles of approval from the crowd. We could have chosen to crumble or self-destruct when facing the odds against us. But every person in this room has chosen to stand their ground against the terrors we will face. And we made that decision because we strive for a better and safer community. Before we move forward, I would like to know if there is anyone new among us who may not understand the fight you have chosen to partake in. From my spot in the middle of the crowded room, I could tell that Officer Baker was staring right at me. He sat silently as a few hands slowly raised into the air to indicate these were the individuals he was asking about. I realized he was waiting for me to join in, so I raised my hand. "Well," Officer Baker started pulling out a small device and pointing it to the big screen in the front of the meeting area. He pressed the button and the screen lit to life with the same title that had been on the whiteboard at the meeting room's entrance. "I would like to welcome you on behalf of my associates around you. And I would like to congratulate you on deciding that enough is enough." The crowd around me erupted into an explosion of applause. A few people in the back even gave a wolf whistle or two for good measure. More than half the group got to their feet, elongating the thunderous applause to continue for a lot longer than one would expect. I did not join them on my feet or in applause. Instead, I sat wondering what the hell was happening around me. For too long the people of this town have been hunted, Officer Baker continued after the applause died down and the townsfolk fell back in their seat. Just a little more than a week ago another poor soul was lost to the scourge that has infested our once safe haven. Officer Baker aimed a little remote device he had used to turn on the screen directly at me. With the push of a button, a red light flashed on. I looked down at my chest to find an identical red dot placed the center mass of my chest. I figured this was exactly what they had lured me here to do. It was my own fault for coming. I did not plan to fight what I assume came next, but still my hands still involuntarily clutched the arms of the chair I was in. But the police officers in the room did not surround me and the other members of the community didn't begin to tear me to shreds. I wasn't even vaporized by the device he held trained on me because it was just a laser pointer. This poor soul, Officer Baker started with a crack in his voice from grief. He had to wake to find his neighbor and friend had been brutally torn apart. I would like to apologize to you Wilcanova for failing to stop an outcome we knew was possible. We tried of course. When Mr. Burgess had first purchased the murder house several members of our association tried to warn him. But he just laughed off the danger claiming he would be fine. We should have been persistent. I am sorry William. Many people in the auditorium mimicked Officer Baker's sympathy to me. A few even aimed sad, apologetic glances my direction. The older woman sitting beside me clasped my left hand with her cold wrinkled fingers and gave me it a quick squeeze while she looked at me with tears in her eyes. We should have done more, a tearful woman's voice shot from behind me somewhere. There was no need for another damn life to be taken in that death trap, a man's rage-filled yell came from the front right the theater. Murder house. The words continued to turn over and over in my brain, but I was unable to wrap my head around what was happening. I sat quietly through the cries of anger and regret Miles until it died down around the room. Officer Baker stood patiently until his fellow townsfolk had gotten it out of their system. I know friends, he called into the crowd silencing the last of the voices. A man in the prime of his life cut down by such an awful monster. It is now our job to ensure nothing like this ever happens again in that accursed house. We need to take the fight to them. Wait, I called out over the crowd. Logically I knew I should keep my mouth shut, but the strangeness of the situation forced the words out of me. Do you know what happened to Miles? Come now William, Officer Baker answered with calm pity in his tone. You are among friends here. You no longer have to deny the existence of the vile spirit that infested Mr. Burgess' home. The same vile spirit who tore him to shreds in the middle of the night. Officer Baker moved back to addressing the crowd, but I was unable to follow what he was saying. He had just claimed in front of a group of adults that Miles had been killed by a spirit, and not one person decided to question him. In fact, I had seen several people nearby nod in agreement. I had walked into Miles' home and brutally stabbed him over and over again, leaving a trail of evidence a child could have followed to me. And these people believed he was killed by a fucking ghost. That doesn't make any sense. I interrupted again. Every time I opened my mouth it called attention to the reality I was the killer. But the sheer ridiculousness drove me. You think that Miles was killed by a ghost? Of course, Officer Baker replied with a matter-of-fact inflection in his voice. What else could have possibly got into him in the dead of night and murdered him in such a grotesque fashion? A person, I answered. All around me people's heads turned my direction. Instead of sympathy this time their faces looked mortified and confused at what I had said. A few people even exchanged nervous glances with one another. The old woman who had squeezed my hand sat as far away from me as she could in her seat with her mouth agape. "So, what you are telling me is," Officer Baker started, clearly growing annoyed with me, "a member of this community made their way into Miles Burgess' home in the dead of night and committed such a heinous act." "It makes far more sense than a ghost," I answered firmly, no longer care at all what it might mean for me. The craziness of all of this needed to be addressed. These people were so afraid to admit one of their neighbors was a killer they had fled into a world of fantasy. "Son," Officer Baker retorted as if he was addressing a petulant schoolchild, "I will have you know that Mr. Burgess is not the first person to have died in that house unexpectedly." "Yeah?" An older man's voice from my left yelled out in agreement. "In 1955 Missy Hayworth was stabbed to death in her sleep. Her husband said the knife just floated into the room and slit the poor woman's throat." "Exactly," another voice, this time a woman's, joined in from the other side of the room. "And after her grief-stricken husband moved away with his secretary, he sold the house to Arthur Dermont. 25 years later Arthur was found hanging from the second-floor landing. They say the haunting got so bad he rarely had the strength to get out of bed near the end." "What happened next?" A third woman's voice yelled out the rhetorical question from somewhere behind me. "Roberta Armistead bought the house a few months later. 37 years later she drops dead. That woman ran every day and ate right, but her heart suddenly gives out. Like she was scared to death." The crowd words grew into an incoherent uproar. While Officer Baker struggles to get everyone quiet, I thought over the information they gave me. A woman is killed by her cheating spouse. Another man succumbs to depression. And finally, Roberta Armistead. For Christ's sakes, had been my neighbor when I moved in. Sure, she had run and eaten right. But only after her third heart attack. All of these people died from explainable situations, and this room full of fools thought they were being killed by vengeful spirits. "Now William, look at the evidence," Officer Baker said, still addressing me as an annoyed teacher. The rest of the theater had finally gotten back in line. What else could have happened in that house that night? Only a fool would think. I began with the heat of anger behind my face. But I paused for a moment. Looking at the face of Officer Baker, and remembering my situation. Cooled down a bit, I started again in a much calmer tone. Only a fool would think that anything besides a horrible abomination from hell could have committed such a heinous act. That terrible demon killed my good friend Miles in his own home. He deserved better. He was a good man. Leaning back into my seat, I felt the tension in the room give way while members of the crowd nodded in affirmation. Officer Baker took back control of the meeting and continued from where he had left off before my interruption. "I guess these people didn't want to confront the reality of what humans are capable of doing to one another. Luckily for them, I had gotten it out of my system with Miles. But as the meeting went on, I did think about how the house would probably be up for sale again in a little while. If anything happened to the new resident, they would probably just assume it was the curse of the murder house again. Hell, even if they condemned the thing, people would probably dare each other to go in and spend the night around Halloween. That dumb shit teenagers in small towns to avoid the monotony of living in the middle of nowhere." The thought did give me a bit of a thrill. Honestly, though, I was not planning on using that house to murder anyone else. But to be fair, I was not planning on not using the house to murder anyone either. That meeting ended a few hours ago, but I already have most of the possessions I really need to be packed into my SUV. Anything else still in the house when I leave tomorrow afternoon will be given to Goodwill or thrown in the trash. Either way works for me. When all the ideas about the future of Miles' house had finished dancing through my head, I started paying attention to the meeting again. I had missed a lot, and they were starting a remembrance of all the townsfolk they had lost over the last 12 months. Of course, they said each and every one of them was due to some ridiculous fantasy being. It had started pretty entertainingly seeing all of the rationalizations, or non-rationalizations, they used to explain death by natural causes or accident. Some woman had died after getting drunk in her above-ground pool and drowning. They claimed she had been lured into the pool by the beautiful song of mermaids and viciously pulled under the water. When anyone died of cancer, it was blamed on an elusive pack of vampires just outside of town. The teen who died in a drunk driving accident a month ago was said to have been attacked by the Mothman. It got less amusing when they moved on to the non-accidental deaths. A woman who had clearly had her throat slit was said to have been mauled by a yeti. A young girl who disappeared last December was whisked away by a Wendigo. A pretty obvious gunshot victim had been a werewolf. Officer Baker himself had bravely gunned down in the dead of night. More and more murder victims were brought up and immediately explained away with fantasy bullshit. The loss of life was not what made me decide to pack up and leave. I felt as much for the dead as I did for Miles after I had stuck a knife in his throat. And he had been someone I had known and interacted with regularly. Most, but not all, of the people brought up in the remembrance were drifters who were just passing through town. What told me it was time to get out of Dodge was the slow realization that I was not the only killer in that room. With every passing story, the chance raised that one of the people sitting around me had murdered someone as well. Each fantasy monster was just a representation of someone in the auditorium who had brutally murdered someone. It was clear there were two kinds of people sitting around me. It was clear the people around me fit into two different categories. Murderers and people unwilling to admit their friends and family were capable of murder. It was a strange realization that I am unwilling to live in a town of people like me or the type of people who would protect me. This is the story of a recurring nightmare I had as a child. I can place my age between about 4 and 8 because that was how old I was when we lived in the house where I had the dream. My room was next door to my parents', both looking out over our back garden, which went back quite a way and ended in a large hedge, behind which was a park. My little brother and I were always keen to get a gate leading onto the park, but we never did. There was a patio below my window, but no conservatory or anything, just a straight brick wall. I shouldn't logically have worried about anything getting up to my window, but children, and dreams, aren't exactly logical. The dream was always the same, and pretty simple. I was in my bed, which sat next to the window, but rather than having my curtains drawn they were wide open. Which is how I could see the wolf, 3 or 4 times my size, snarling and clawing to get through at me. That's it. No chase, nothing elaborate, just some double glazing between me and a truly terrifying beast. Every time I had the dream I'd try something different, bury my head under the covers, shut the curtains, shout at the wolf or brandish one of my toy guns or swords to try and scare it off. But it just kept clawing away, trying to open the window and get me. I didn't have this dream night after night, but it showed up often enough, and always the same, me unable to do anything but hope that the wolf wouldn't get through the window. Now I'm sure most of you will have had recurring dreams, particular nightmares that haunted you, etc. And for a child that age, wolves aren't exactly an unusual bugbear. What makes this dream pretty spooky to look back on now are 2 things. First, the reaction I got when I told my parents about the dream. My mother told me that she had had the exact same dream when she was my ages, also recurring, only with a lion instead of a wolf. Her in her bedroom, the lion at the window, trying to get in and nothing she could do but wait in fear. Now she told me this to try and make me less scared of the dream, but even at that age, I could tell that she was pretty spooked by the similarity. But what really makes me think about the nightmare, and ensures I bring it up whenever I have a conversation with someone about scary childhood dreams, is how it ended. Our house was across the road from a sporting goods shop, but really oddly in England, this shop, along with rugby balls, cricket bats and Wellington boots, sold shotguns, air guns, and crossbows. Which for a boy my age made it cool beyond belief. Whenever my mother decided to take me to the newsagent for sweets as a treat after school, every other week or so, I'd get my kind egg or Freddo frog or what have you, and run out to stare in the window next door at all the guns. If there was a classmate or two with me, we'd make classic uninformed kids' judgments about which gun was the best. One night, I was having the wolf dream again, but this time I tried something new. Rather than hide or face it down, I did what any child is supposed to do when confronted with a threat. I walked to the next room and told my parents. I dreamt my father walked into my room after I told him, and sized up the beast clawing at the window. Then he pulled on some jeans, a t-shirt and the bomber jacket he wore when we went to the park in cold weather, and walked out the front door across the road. I dreamt I watched him, fearful and expectant, from my brother's window at the front of the house as he returned from the gun shop, a rifle under his arm. And finally, I dreamt he walked into the back garden, aimed up at the wolf and shot it down dead. I guess at that age you assume your dad's always the hero who saves the day, but in my case it was true. Because after my father shot that wolf dead in my dream, it never came back to trouble my sleep. Not once. Late summer, 1986. We were driving through the Rocky Mountains on our way to our array. There were three of us, Steve, Danny, and me. We were young, dumb, and fed up with what life was really like after college. So we bought some matches, packed a cooler of beer, food, and beer, and loaded up my trusty Toyota with all the fixings for a classic camping trip. This trip was supposed to shake up the devastating monotony of our daily life, and shake us up it did, to the very core. Right before we were getting ready to set out, Steve's mom ran out of the house and told him he should take their newly adopted family dog, Luna, for safety. Steve was hesitant. He didn't want to have to look after the dog, especially if we were going to be drinking. And she was a big dog, a mixed husky and something else, Great Dane maybe. But his mom insisted until, finally, he broke and agreed to take her. Luna looked up at him with her warm blue eyes and seemed to smile. Steve sighed and said, "I guess I'll sit in the back with her." "No, I said, walking over and patting her head, "let her sit up front with me." She wagged her tail. Most of the car ride went smoothly, and we sang along to the radio, the mood at cows, and waved at, or flipped off, motorcyclists. But as we neared our destination, and the sun sank behind us leaving us in a thick, almost tangible darkness, we started to become jumpy, pointing at strange shadows and swift movements. Luna, though, was curled up and asleep beside me, unaware of our growing fear. The sky was covered in big, roiling clouds that blew swiftly towards the east, covering and revealing the full moon at random intervals. By now we were the only vehicle on the road. My headlights barely sliced the darkness around us as we weaved our way through the mountains. The isolation, the darkness, the silence, it was all so crushing. Steve, I thought you said we would be there before the sunset. I told you we shouldn't have stopped at that bar. Or, Danny, I didn't know we'd be there for that long. You wouldn't stop your stupid pool game. And I won. Come on, it's not that dark out. Would some money make you happy? You idiot. Hey, cool it, look, what the hell is that? I slowed the car down to a stop, trying to see what was blocking the road, but the light from the cloud-covered moon was too dim. What the hell? Danny, I whispered as she rolled down her window. I was apprehensive, worried this was someone's attempt to rob us, or worse. I had heard all the urban legends before. I just want to see better. She stuck her head out of the window and I rolled a little bit closer. Luna, feeling the change in the car's movement, lifted her head and sat up, panting. Oh shit, I think it's a dead deer. You guys, gross. Danny retreated back inside the car and rolled the window back up. Who the hell just leaves something like that on the road? Assholes, Steve said, then leaned forward. Hey, man, think you can drive around it? Yeah, I think I can. I approached the thing, now seeing the antlers and the gleaming black eyes, open, staring, dead. It blinked. I yelped and jerked the steering wheel, sideswiping the mountainside. Shit. What the hell, man? It's alive. What? That fucking deer, it's alive. As I spoke, the deer lifted its head and bleated. The sound echoed around the chasm. We all jumped and watched as it pushed itself up until it was standing on its hind legs, like a man, but uncanny, grotesque. Mesmerized, we sat unable to move as the thing walked over to us, slowly, decidedly, as if walking on two legs was a thing this deer did often. It leaned down next to Danny's window, its face so close to the glass that steam from its nose fogged it up. A low noise rang out through the car. Luna was growling, her hackles raised, crouched in the seat next to me. Bang! The thing rammed its head into the window. Chaos erupted. Danny screamed, piercing, high. Luna started barking, booming, persistent. Steve yelled, telling me to fucking go, just go. I, shaking, struggled with the clutch, stalling. Bang. The window cracked and the thing started making an incredible sound. It sounded like a weird screeching, a guttural form of laughter. Finally, the clutch caught and I spun the hell out of there. I checked the rear view and saw the thing, standing on two legs, looking after us. Suddenly it leapt forward and began running after us. It ran on two legs instead of four, and it was fast. So fucking fast. I drove as fast as I could on that winding mountain road, but, despite my speed, the thing still caught up with us. It tapped its antlers on my window and screeched that weird laughter again. Then it pointed in front of us, bared its teeth, and stopped. The abruptness of how quickly it disappeared caught me off guard. Watch out. I snapped forward and what I saw made me slam on my brakes. A house. A fucking house, in the middle of the road. I guess it was more of a cottage or a hut, but there it was, clear, vivid, in front of us. Danny was audibly crying in the back seat, repeating, "What the fuck?" over and over to herself. Steve was breathing heavily as he had just run a marathon. Luna was whimpering beside me and scratching at the window. Nausea enveloped me, made worse by the vibration from my pounding heart. Seriously, what the fuck is going on? I think I'm going to puke, man. Don't open that door. Just back up, Turn around. Man. Let's go back. Towards that dot thing? No fucking way, man. Well, if you didn't fucking notice, there's a goddamn house in front of me. Just drive through it, Commander. No, 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 no. Danny, calm down. It's okay. We're okay. We'll be okay. Danny simpered and started sobbing again. Shut the fuck up, Danny, please. Guys, look, oh god. The house. It was spinning, slowly, and stopped when the front of it pointed directly at my car. The door to the house slammed open, emitting a sound like a gunshot. A single point of light emerged from the darkness inside the house. A candle. And holding it up was a figure, stooped over, covered in what looked like blackened rags. It began to approach us, lurching forward swift, then slow, then swift again. It was making this eerie deep staccato sound. Are you for real right now? Steve was leaning forward, peering out the windshield. Let's go. Reverse. That thing is behind us. Run it over. Look, look. Danny screamed. The stooped figure was now running at full speed straight at us. It slammed onto my hood and we could finally see that it was an old woman, covered in wrinkles, completely bald, with sharpened yellow teeth. She was moaning and moaning. She crawled up the hood, opened her mouth, and licked the glass, leaving a trail of blood-colored saliva. Luna went wild, barking, foaming at the mouth, throwing herself at the door. Please, 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 please. Back up now. I slammed my foot on the gas, but my tires made a sickening sound and the smell of burnt rubber slipped into the car. It's behind us. It's fucking behind us. I turned back to see the deer's head, teeth still bared, peering at me from the back window. Shit, fuck, what do we do? What do I do? Luna, no. With a final lunge, Luna forced the door open. It sounds shocking, but she was such a large dog, and strong. A powerful wind picked up and the roiling clouds dissipating, allowing the light from the full moon to illuminate the scene in front and behind us. Luna was as still as a statue, slightly crouched, poised to leap. The hackles on her back quivered and a single thread of drool spun itself down from her mouth. She began to shake, faster and faster. It looked like she was having a seizure. The old woman and the deer thing were both looking over at her. Something strange was happening to Luna. It looked as if her limbs were breaking, elongating. Her snout narrowed, sinking closer to her face. She rose up onto her hind legs, humanoid, and howled up towards the sky before locking eyes with the hag on my car. In the blink of an eye, Luna was on the woman, ripping her away, shaking her to and fro in her jaw like a ragdoll. Luna flung the woman towards the house and she struck it with some force and didn't get back up. The house and their woman vanished in a puff of smoke. Luna turned towards the thing behind us. It screeched, raising itself up to its full height, challenging her. Luna howled again, then licked her fangs. The thing took 2 steps towards her, before turning tail and fleeing down the road, Luna giving chase. They both ran on 2 legs, instead of 4. We sat in total silence for a few moments, until I leaned over and slammed the passenger side door closed. I think Danny passed out. I turned to look at Steve. He looked at me. Let's get out of here, man. We got 2 miles before the thunk beneath us couldn't be ignored any longer. A flat tire. I pulled over and we eyed the darkness around us, paranoid. I'm not changing it. I'm not going out there, Steve said, loudly. Don't worry. There's no spare. What? I took it out, to make room for all the camping stuff. Are you fucking kidding me? Nope. Well, what the hell do we do now? I sighed. I didn't know. Suddenly, like magic, like a miracle, headlights appeared behind us. A godsend, a car. I hope they're normal. Me too. Should we tell them? We locked eyes again. No. If they bring it up, maybe. If it's a cop, definitely not. He'll think we're high. The car rolled up beside us. It was totally black with tinted windows. The window rolled down and behind it sat a middle-aged man. He looked tired, maybe sad. Need some help? Oh, thank God, Steve whispered. Yes, flat tire, don't have a spare. Well, that's dumb, the man said. You should always carry a spare, always. Never know what could happen. Lucky for you, I think I have one that will fit your car. You joking? The man shook his head and hopped out of his car. He was dressed sharply, black suit, black tie, black shoes, all covered by a trench coat. Come on, you can hold the flashlight for me. I hesitated, then exited the car. What happened here? He pointed to the window next to Danny's head. Oh, it's been like that for a while. The dumb neighbor kid hit it with a baseball. The man nodded, and her? Tired. Just tired. We've been driving for a while. Driving where? Our array, for camping. Nice place. We've heard. Say, the man said, releasing the jack. The job is done. Seen anything weird tonight? My heart sped up, and I looked around us half expecting the deer, or the woman, or Luna to come sprinting towards us. What do you mean weird? Oh, I dunno. Anything out of the ordinary? No, why? Oh, no reason. Just heard some spooky tales. Tales? That the natives who used to live around here would tell. What tales? The man stood up and dusted his hands off on his coat. Well, he said, ignoring my question, you're all set. You're about 20 minutes out from our array, and 2 hours from the sunrise. I'd advise you get a move on. Never know what might be stalking you out there. I'm headed the same way. Actually, I can drive behind you if you like. A muffled yes came from inside the car and we both looked up to see Steve nodding voraciously. Yeah, that would be great actually. The corners of the man's mouth twitched a bit as he nodded, sliding back into his car. We drove to our array without incident and, as soon as we hit the city, the man in the car behind us flashed his brights twice, then flipped a U-turn, speeding back down the way we came. I thought he said he was going this way, I said looking in my rear view. Who cares, let's get a hotel room and leave first thing tomorrow morning, Danny said. She had woken up as we were driving towards our array. We filled her in on the strange man and how he helped us, but she was still spooked and jumpy. And we did just that. We didn't dare camp in the wilderness or even leave the relative safety of the town. On the way back to civilization, we swore to never tell anyone what happened. It was too weird, uncanny, horrifying. Steve was silent, afraid of what his mom might say or do about Luna. We made up some story about how she had fallen over a cliff after chasing a deer. Poor Luna. We did stop for an hour, around the area it happened and called out to her, but to no avail. We never saw her again. It's been years since this happened and I'm old now. The three of us lost touch after we returned from the trip, but vowed to keep this secret to our death. Last I heard, Steve died from a heart attack and Danny was diagnosed with stomach cancer. I figured it's about time I shared my tale. Maybe it'll help me make some semblance of sense out of it. In the end, though, I don't know if those things were protecting us from her, or if she was protecting us from them. I guess I'll never know. Sometimes, late at night, when I hear howling, I like to imagine it's Luna, out there, somewhere, running free in the wild.